Hello YouTube, Dave here again. Today we are concluding our look at the Through the Ages series on the history of the Barbarian. This is the third installment for that particular sub-series of the Through the Ages. The first one was a look at the Dungeons and Dragons Barbarian from 1st edition AD&D all the way through to the current 5th edition. The second installment, the bonus episode, I guess you could say, was some variant options for the Dungeons & Dragons Barbarian, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Pathfinder Barbarian. So this is the Paizo published role-playing game based off of the Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 open gaming license. And we'll see some evolution through things like the playtest, the 2nd edition, and even some variant options from some 1st edition Pathfinder products. There are certain books and things that I won't be able to discuss because I simply don't own them, such as the original Pathfinder Alpha and Beta playtest packages, as well as Pathfinder Unchained, so those are things I just don't have access to at this point in time. If that changes, I can always do a little extra bonus episode. So we're actually going to start with the Pathfinder 1st Edition Barbarian here. And one of the important things to note is Pathfinder 1st Edition is very much based off of 3.5 Dungeons & Dragons. So there's going to be a lot of similarities, especially when we're looking at the classes. So there are some changes, though, that are important to note. So we're, again, looking at the Barbarian. They still get their D12 hit dice. They still have an alignment requirement of non-lawful. The same number of skill points that they get per level, as well as things like armor and weapon proficiency, fast movement, and their rage ability functions mechanically the same way as Rage from Dungeons & Dragons 3.5, with one notable exception. So in 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons, the Barbarian raged for a number of rounds equal to, I think it was 3 or 4 plus their new con modifier after it was changed with the Rage ability. So here, Rage still gives them +4 to their... still gives them their increase to strength and constitution, as well as the morale bonus to will saves and the penalty to armor class. However, the duration of their rage is done by a number of rounds per day equal to 4 plus their constitution modifier. Each level after first, they can rage for an additional 2 rounds. So if a first level barbarian had let's just say a 14 constitution, she could rage for 6 rounds per day, and upon gaining 2nd level, could rage for 8 rounds. So instead of it having it be a certain number of times per day, it's just the amount of time you can sustain that rage overall. So it's sort of an interesting change from there. Everything else is pretty much the exact same as what we had before. The trap sense, the trap sense, damage reduction, greater rage, indomitable will, and like tireless rage and mighty rage, those all take place at the same levels that they did in 3rd edition, with the same sort of numbers as far as like damage reduction, trap sense, and things like that go. One major addition to the Barbarian class in Pathfinder is the introduction of rage powers. So these are extra abilities that the Barbarian gets while they are currently raging. There's a whole list of them here. I'm not going to go through every single one, but we will take a look at a couple of the ones that I just kind of like the most. So one of the ones that I really like here would be for something like Moment of Clarity. So the Barbarian does not gain any benefits or take any penalties from Rage for 1 round. Activating this power is a swift action. This includes the penalty to armor class and the restriction on what can be performed. This round still counts against the total number of rounds of Rage per day, however, but for example, if you required the use of a particular skill, or if you were multi-classed into a spellcasting class and you needed to be able to cast a spell, you could use that ability, which I think is pretty cool. Mighty Swing, the Barbarian automatically confirms a critical hit, which was a big thing in 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons. This power is used as an immediate action once a critical threat has been determined. A Barbarian must be at least 12th level before selecting this power, and it can only be used once per rage. So these powers, again, they can't all just be taken whenever. Several of them will have a particular level range that they require. Another one I like here is Superstition. The Barbarian gains a +2 morale bonus on saving throws made to resist spells, supernatural abilities, and spell-like abilities, and increases by +1 for every 4 levels the Barbarian has attained. while Raging the Barbarian cannot be a willing target of any spell and must make saving throws to resist all spells, even those cast by allies. The reason I like that is it reminds me a lot of the early AD&D first edition Barbarian, where they did not care for magic at all. Another one I think is kind of cool here is Raging Leaper. So when Raging the Barbarian adds her level as an enhancement bonus to all acrobatic skill checks made to jump. When making a jump in this way, the Barbarian is always considered to have a running start. That just reminds me of like the Diablo 2 Barbarian, where they would just like leap all over the place. And I think before it was patched out, it got like utterly ridiculous. And I remember a friend and I were going through Diablo 2, and he just like, I was playing a paladin, and his Barbarian was just bouncing all over the place. It was really cool. So now we are going to move on to the Pathfinder playtest. For the purposes of this section of the video, I'm only going to be looking at the original printed material that came out in the physical books or the initial PDF download that you could have gotten from Paizo's website. I'm not going to be looking at all of the updates in between, because those updates are going to culminate in the second edition Pathfinder classes anyway, and I think it makes more of an impact to show the initial ideas that they had before they started tweaking things and finally arriving at the second edition material. So that's just the formula that this series is going to take when it comes to the Pathfinder playtest in particular. So without further ado, let's get to the Barbarian here. Now, there are a few changes that should be noted when it comes to the Pathfinder playtest as well as Pathfinder 2nd Edition. For example, hit dice are no longer a thing. You don't roll your hit points any longer. You simply gain a set number of hit points from your ancestry, which you get once, like your race for being elf, dwarf, half-orc, human, what have you. That's a one-time bonus, but your class gives you a set number of hit points plus your con modifier at every level, starting from 1st all up to 20th. And in the case of the Barbarian, they are getting 12 hit points plus their con modifier for every level. So a first level Barbarian with a 16 con would have a +3 modifier, so they would get 15 hit points in addition to whatever their race gave them or their ancestry gave them to add on to that total. For proficiencies, they are considered to be expertly trained in perception, and the training in the Pathfinder playtest goes as untrained, and then you have trained levels, expert, master, and legendary levels of training. Perception is largely used for not just to spot things or to find things that may be hidden, but you also use it a lot of times for your initiative rolls instead of having initiative being something completely separate. Other skills may substitute for initiative, but perception was one of the big ones for that particular system. So one of the things I actually kind of like about that as well. For saving throws, they are expert level of training in fortitude and will, and they have the basic level of training in reflex saves. For skills, they are trained in a number of skills equal to 3 plus their intelligence modifier. So a barbarian with a 10 intelligence, for example, would be trained in 3 skills. Now, your backgrounds and stuff and ancestries could also potentially impact the skills that you have training in, but this is just what the class itself specifically gives you. For weapons, you were considered to be trained in all simple and martial weapons, and for armor, you were considered to be trained in light and medium armor. Signature skills were a thing in the playtest that actually got dropped relatively quickly. So I'm not really going to discuss what they were, but the best way to look at them is they're sort of the skills most commonly associated with the class. So the big thing that we're going to take a look here with the Barbarian for the Pathfinder playtest is obviously going to be the features that they get, and the biggest feature has to be Barbarian Rage. So Barbarians can fly into a dangerous battle rage, and you gain the Rage action. So it takes one of your 3 actions that you can do each round to initially enter the Rage. The requirements to enter a rage is that you can't be fatigued, raging, or wearing heavy armor. They're not proficient in heavy armor, so that shouldn't be an issue. You begin raging as the benefit here. You gain a number of temporary hit points equal to your level plus your constitution modifier, and enter a state of pure rage that lasts for 3 rounds. While you are raging, you are affected in the following ways. You gain a +2 conditional bonus to damage rolls with melee weapons and unarmed strikes. The bonus is halved if your weapon or unarmed strike is considered agile, so you would use your dex instead of your strength. This bonus increases by 1 at level 3 and every 4 levels thereafter. So at 3rd level it goes up to 3 from 2, and then at 7th level you would gain another +1, 11th level, 15th, and then finally 19th level. You take a -1 penalty to armor class, and you can't use actions that require concentration unless they also have the rage trait associated with them. The Seek basic action gains the rage trait while you're raging, so if an enemy is hiding from you, you can still use the Seek action without having to drop out of rage. After you have stopped raging, you lose any remaining temporary hit points from using your rage action. You can't use rage again for 1 round, and you are fatigued for 1 round. You can't voluntarily stop raging. If you stop raging before its usual duration expires, you are fatigued and can't rage again until the end of your next turn. So basically you get 3 rounds of rage, then you have to take a round, sort of a breather from it, and then you can rage again and get like the temporary hit points, the bonus damage, and the -1 to armor class. Another class feature of barbarians in the Pathfinder playtest are referred to as totems. They are sort of a traditional symbol or a source of inspiration or energy that within yourself that you can use to influence or power your rages, and we'll touch on those a little bit later on. You also get barbarian feats, so each class in the playtest and bleeding into 2nd edition Pathfinder have their own unique set of feats that they can choose specific to the class itself, and we'll get more into those. The one thing I will say is that several of the feats kind of replicate ones that the classes would typically take in the original Pathfinder, or even going back to the 3.0 and 3.5 D&D versions of the Barbarian, and then several other ones sort of replicate features that you would have had from the Barbarian abilities from 1st edition Pathfinder. We'll touch a little bit more on those. I'm not going to go through every single one, obviously, but we will get to those a little bit later. You also gain things like skill feats, skill increases, general feats, things like that that every single class gets, along with a boost to your ability scores. But we do have some cool abilities in here as well, like critical brutality. While you are raging, you gain access to the critical specialization effect of your melee weapon or unarmed attack that you have. So those features may be things like on a critical hit you may the opponent may be considered grappled. They may be knocked prone. They may be dazed, or things along those lines. That's sort of the way that some weapons have special traits that you can use at higher levels. This one with critical brutality with the Barbarian, they can start doing that on 3rd level, but they have to be raging in order to use it. They also have the Deny Advantage ability, which actually kind of reminds me of the old school AD&D 1st edition Barbarian. You are not treated as flat-footed by creatures of your level or lower that are flanking you, or that are hidden to you. So essentially, if something is your level or lower, and creatures have their own levels instead of necessarily challenge ratings in this version of the game, so if their level is equal to yours or less, they just simply cannot gain the benefits of flanking or sneak attacks or things along those lines. However, they can contribute to flanking for creatures that are higher level than you. So even though they themselves can't benefit, if there's a higher level foe, then they could take advantage of the fact and still get flanking, even if the creature that is helping them flank doesn't get the benefits of it. At 7th level, you get the Juggernaut ability, so you become a master at Fortitude saves, so that increases your training level, and any success that you roll on a Fortitude save is treated as a critical success instead. At 9th level, you gain Raging Resistance equal to your Constitution modifier, which is a minimum of 0, to 2 damage types based on your totem, which we'll get into more when that time comes. At 11th level, you get Mighty Rage, so you get the Mighty Rage free action, which has a trigger that you have to use your rage ability, and whenever you do that, you can use this Mighty Rage to get a free action, basically, that has to have the Barbarian or the Rage trait to it. So we'll sort of get into that when we get into the feats. Improved Juggernaut at 13th level, you become legendary in Fortitude saves, and if you critically fail on a saving throw, you treat it as a regular failure instead. And if you get a regular failure on a saving throw for Fortitude, you just take half the damage instead of the full normal damage that you would take otherwise. At 13th level, you also get Weapon Fury. Your proficiency rank for simple weapons, martial weapons, and unarmed strikes increases from trained to expert. 15th level, you get Indomitable Will, which lets you go to master level of training in will saves. And again, if you get a regular success, it's treated as a critical success instead. 17th level, you get Tireless Rage. You don't become fatigued after you stop raging, but you still have to wait the one round in order to be able to rage again. And at 19th level, you get Devastating Strikes. Your strikes are so devastating that you hardly care about wielding the best weapons against each monster. If you succeed at a melee strike against a creature with resistance against the physical damage type of the weapon or unarmed attack you're using, you reduce that resistance by a number equal to twice your Constitution modifier, minimum of 0. So again, if you had a con modifier of 3, you could reduce their resistance to like slashing if it's like a great axe or a great sword. You could reduce that by 6 because it's 2 times 3. Now, getting into the totems. So totems, as a barbarian, you channel the power of your rage through a totem. Traditionally, this is a spiritual or tribal symbol, but you choose what your totem means to you. It might describe a purely internal source or filter for your rage, such as belief, curse, exotic heritage, or state of mind. Each totem grants you a totem ability, plus more abilities that you can gain via totem feats, which you choose when you gain your barbarian feats. They just have the totem trait or requirement to them. It also determines what your raging resistance is for your raging class or for your barbarian rage class feature, and each totem lists acts that are anathema to it. Whenever you perform such acts, you lose the totem's power and any totem feats until you spend 1 day of downtime recentering yourself, though you keep all other barbarian abilities. So you would still have your normal rage, for example, but you might lose the raging resistance or feats that might increase things that are available only through the totem that you chose. So I'm only going to look at a couple of the totems here. I'm not going to go through every single one. The ones I'm actually going to take a look at here. So we have like animal totems, for example, where your rage ability grants you unarmed attacks that you can make. And your anathema is to fight with either like manufactured weapons or to attack or disrespect creatures from your animal type. There's the dragon totems, which give you things like resistance to the energy type of the dragon that you choose to have as your totem, like black, blue, green, gold, white, red, all those things. And the raging resistance or the draconic rage lets you do extra damage that's based off of your barbarian rage damage bonus, is the energy type, for example. So if you had red dragon as your dragon totem, then the extra damage you get for your rage would be fire damage instead of just additional weapon-based damage. And so instead of slashing, for example, with a great axe, it would be fire damage instead. So those are some of those features. But the ones I'm going to look at here in particular are going to be the Superstition Totem and the Fury Totem. So starting with the Fury Totem, actually let's start with the Superstition Totem because it actually falls into the totem abilities precisely as they are. So Superstition, it says a deep distrust of magic drives you to forego the metaphysical nonsense of spellcasters. I like that phrasing. Whether you're a member of a superstitious tribe that distrusts magic, a survivor of a magical accident that left your mind and body with an intense aversion to magic, or a scion of a bloodline known for its magic resistance, your rage is inimical to magic. This makes you an excellent mage hunter, but slow to trust practitioners of magical arts. Your extremely restrictive anathema grants you powers beyond those of other totems. So the anathema, willingly accepting the effects of magic spells, including from scrolls, wands, and the like, even from your allies, is anathema to your totem. You can still drink potions, and you can still invest and activate most magic items you find, though items that cast spells are subject to the same restrictions as all other spells. If an ally insists on using magic on you despite your unwillingness, and you have no reason to believe they will stop, continuing to travel with that ally counts as willingly accepting their spells, as do similar circumstances, and thus also anathema to your totem. So it's like that old superstitious, well, that's the name of it, right? But it's the old complete distrust and disdain for all things spell-like from the barbarians that we had going back to their earliest days in the first edition AD&D. So that's something that I think is really, really an interesting aspect to them. Superstitious Resistance. While raging, you gain a +2 conditional bonus to all saves against magic, and that's all saves. Your raging resistance. So normally they might be things like the animal totem, I think, gives you resistance to piercing and slashing damage. I think like the giant totem gives you resistance to bludgeoning damage. The raging resistance for the superstition totem lets you choose 2 associated magical traditions: arcane and occult, arcane and primal, divine and occult, or divine and primal. So those are sort of like spell lists, basically. The resistance from your raging resistance class feature applies against all damage you take from spells of those 2 traditions of magic, regardless of the type of damage dealt by the spell. So if you take arcane and someone casts fireball at you, even though you're not resistant to fire, you would be resistant to that arcane spell because that's one of the traditions that you have the resistance or the apprehension to, essentially. So again, a really, really interesting one there, and a nice callback to the earliest versions of the class, dating back to back into the 1970s, late 70s, early 80s. And then we have the Fury Totem. The Fury Totem is more like your traditional D20 era barbarian. So these ones don't actually have an anathema. This is just sort of purely a rage type character. They don't draw it from an aspect of nature or their religious beliefs. They get this just from within, essentially. So anathema and totem ability, you don't have an anathema or totem ability. Instead, you gain an additional first level barbarian feat. So the trade-off between the Fury ability and any other totem sort of thing is that you don't get as powerful a set of abilities from it. However, you never risk your actions or your party's actions potentially causing you to lose your Fury ability. So it's the trade-off of dependability at the expense of some more maybe unique or interesting class features. Your raging resistance, you resist all physical weapon damage. So that's again, you resist 3 different types: piercing, slashing, and bludgeoning, instead of the 2 different types that all other things usually give you. So again, some great stuff there. Barbarian feats, so like I said, these are things that mimic some of the rage abilities that you had from first edition Pathfinder, and some of them are just sort of things that would be traditional feats from the D20 era or Pathfinder first edition that just make sense for a barbarian to have. For example, we have Moment of Clarity, which was one of the rage abilities that we had in first edition. So they essentially lose the benefits and drawbacks of rage for 1 round. It still counts against the number of rounds that they're raging, but if they have to do something that requires concentration, or they don't want to have that negative to their armor class, then that's something that they can use for that. So that's Moment of Clarity. You have Acute Vision, so while you're raging, visual senses improve, granting you low light vision and dark vision. So that's something that we had in the first edition one, where there were, I think, 2 different types that you would have to choose one and then the other. This one just sort of grants it both at the same time. They even have like Acute Scent, which is pretty cool, which just gives you the scent feature, so you don't have to rely on sight or hearing, or visual or auditory senses. So we have stuff like that. We have Cleave, which is a feat that you would typically take for a character like this. Just if you knock down one of your opponents, if someone else is adjacent to you, you can make another attack against them without it being affected by multiple attack penalties. So there's stuff like that. There are ones, again, that are specific to the individual totem. So we have like Dragon Totem Breath. Requires the Dragon Totem. Frequency is once per hour. This essentially gives you the breath weapon associated with the dragon type. So there are things along those lines. Also, we have some of these rage abilities here as well. Like, so Cleave, for example. Actually, that's probably a bad one to choose. But if we're looking at the Mighty Rage, for example, which gives you a free rage ability, you could do something like, if you had the Giant Totem, you could take Giant Stature and use it as a free action, or as an extra action, essentially, from the Mighty Rage ability. So that's one of those ones, because it has rage in its description. So again, just really great stuff here overall. And the one thing I will say that I like about the playtest version of the Barbarian Rage abilities or feats, class feats in general, is that they're actually broken down by what level character you have to be in order to get them. Actually, level in the class, not just necessarily the character, although multi-classing in the playtest was far different from what we had in Pathfinder First Edition. But it's something where you don't have to get to the end of the description of the ability, the rage ability, to know what level you have to be. It's just spelled out here for you, and it's a nice organizational thing that I really appreciate. So that is the Pathfinder playtest Barbarian. So this is sort of the initial ideas that they had from transitioning from first edition to second edition. So let's take a look and see what the finalized version was, and take a look at Pathfinder second edition. So now we are going to have a look at the Pathfinder 2nd Edition Barbarian. There's going to be a lot of similarities to the playtest, but there are also going to be some differences as well. So let's just dive right into it, shall we? So starting off with some of the major similarities, the initial proficiencies and hit points is the same that we had with the playtest, so they still get 12 plus their con modifier at every level. They're still considered to be expert level training in perception, fortitude, and will saves, as well as trained in reflex saves. They are automatically trained in athletics now, and 3 other skills plus their intelligence modifier, as opposed to just 3 plus their int modifier before. So the classes now usually give you at least 1 skill that you are automatically trained in addition to the ones that you would gain normally. You are trained in simple, martial, and unarmed strikes. You are trained in light armor, medium armor, and not wearing any armor, and your class DC is something that you're trained in as well. Your class DC is just any ability that might trigger a saving throw from someone. This is the DC that you would use as the class one. So you are considered to be trained in abilities that are derived from your own class, which, makes sense. Alright, so we're going to take a look at one of the big changes here. We're going to look at the Barbarian Rage. So Barbarian Rage still requires the fact that you aren't fatigued or raging, and when you begin your rage, you still gain temporary hit points equal to your level plus your con modifier. So a 16 con, which gives you a +3 modifier at first level, would give you 4 extra hit points. And in this case, however, the rage actually lasts for 1 minute instead of 3 rounds. The rage will end and if you reach the full minute, so if you go the full 10 rounds and you're still raging, at the end of that 10th round, you'll drop out of rage. You'll also end your rage if you don't perceive any enemies around you or if you fall unconscious. You can't voluntarily stop raging, however. While you're raging, you gain 2 additional damage to melee weapons and unarmed attacks. This additional damage is halved if your unarmed attack or your weapon attack has the agile trait, which is similar to what we had before. You take a -1 penalty to your armor class, and you can't use actions with the concentrate trait unless they also have the rage trait. You can still seek while raging. After you stop raging, you lose any remaining temporary hit points, and you can't rage for another full minute. Instead of it just being 1 round in between, because the rage lasts longer now, there is a bit more of a wait in order to be able to use it again. Effectively, it makes it so that you're using it essentially once per combat. The additional damage also does not increase automatically with levels like it had before. But there are ways to increase that damage, which we'll get to. We also have instincts, which are essentially the same thing as what we had for totems. Although the superstition one that we had in the playtest is not in the core rulebook. So we're going to look at the animal instinct, and we're going to look at the fury one because that one's still in here. You still get barbarian feats, skill feats, and deny advantage works pretty much the same way. You aren't considered to be flat-footed to creatures that are hidden, undetected, or flanking you of your level or lower, or creatures of your level or lower using a surprise attack. However, they can still help higher level creatures than your barbarian be able to flank. So they may not get the benefits themselves, but you can't totally ignore them because they might make it easier for something that can benefit from flanking from doing it. You also get your general feats, skill increases, which we had, ability boosts, ancestry feats. But then we get into brutality, and I love that phrase. I just love that ability name. Your fury makes your attacks lethal, or your weapons lethal. Your proficiency rank for melee weapons, martial weapons, and unarmed attacks increases to expert. And while you're raging, you gain access to the critical specialization effects for melee weapons and unarmed strikes. And those are, again, things like you might have a critical specialization ability which allows you to trip your opponent or grapple them or stun them, daze them, whatever it might be. So it gives you that. 7th level you get Juggernaut, so you become accustomed to physical hardship and resist ailments. Your proficiency rank for Fortitude increases to Master, and when you roll a success on a saving throw, Fortitude saving throw, it becomes a critical instead. Weapon Specialization. At 7th level, your Rage helps you hit harder. You deal an additional 2 damage with weapons and unarmed attacks in which you have Expert Proficiency. This damage increases to 3 if you are a Master, or 4 if you're legendary, and you gain your Instincts Specialization ability, which we'll get into those because that is sort of a new, or a little bit of a difference between the two versions. Then we have Lightning Reflexes, which just makes you an expert in the reflex saving throw. Raging Resistance, repeated exposure, and Toughened Skin allow you to fend off harm. While raging, gain resistance equal to 3 plus your con modifier to damage based on your instinct, which was similar to what we had in the playtest. Mighty Rage. Your rage intensifies and lets you burst into action. Your proficiency rank for your Barbarian class DC increases to Expert, and you gain the Mighty Rage free action. So the Mighty Rage free action is a free action that requires you to use the rage action on your turn. Rage is, of course, a one-action ability, as denoted there by that symbol. And what this essentially lets you do is you get to use a free sort of action that has to have the rage trait, and so it's normally a single action. However, you can increase it to 2 if you need to use a 2-action activity with the rage trait. So these are sort of like rage feats for the most part that have those sorts of things. And again, I already talked about the rage feats in the playtest. They're very similar here, so I'm not going to go into those in any great detail, but we'll just look at a couple to try to get use of that Mighty Rage ability. So for example, the one action thing that you could use that's triggered by the Mighty Rage because you used your regular rage on this turn, you could, if you had the ability, use Furious Finish. It's a 2nd level feat. Desperate to finish the fight, you pour all your rage into one final blow. Make a strike. If it hits, you gain a circumstance bonus to damage equal to the number of rounds remaining in your rage, maximum of 10. After the strike, your rage immediately ends and you are fatigued until you rest for at least 10 minutes. That's probably not the one you necessarily want to use right away, but it is an example of something. You also have Shake It Off, so you concentrate on your rage, overcoming fear and fighting back sickness. Reduce your frightened condition value by 1 and attempt a fortitude save to recover from the sickened condition as if you had spent an action retching. You reduce your sickened condition value by 1 on a failure, but not on a critical failure, by 2 on a success, or by 3 on a critical success. So that's one that you could use as well. And then for an example of a 2-action ability with the rage characteristic, we have Vicious Evisceration. You make a vicious attack that maims your enemy. Make a melee strike. If the strike hits and deals damage, the target is drained 1 or drained 2 on a critical success. So those are examples of things that you could use with the Mighty Rage reaction or free action that requires a trigger. So it's sort of a reaction, but it's on your turn. Then we have Greater Juggernaut. So your stalwart physiology, your proficiency rank, and fortitude saves increases to legendary. And then when you roll a critical failure, it gets treated as a regular failure instead. And if you get a regular failure, you take half damage instead of taking the full. Medium Armor Expertise. At 13th level, your training level or rank in light armor, medium armor, or no armor goes from trained to expert. Weapon Fury. At 13th level, your rage makes you more effective with your weapons you wield. Your proficiency ranks for simple weapons, martial weapons, and unarmed attacks increase to Master. 15th level, you get Greater Weapon Specialization. The weapons you've mastered become truly fearsome in your hands. Your damage from weapon specialization increases to 4 with weapons and unarmed strikes, in which you're an expert, 6 if you're a master, and 8 if you're legendary. You gain a greater benefit from your instinct specialization ability, which we'll sort of look at here as well. Indomitable Will gives you master level of training in will saving throws, and you treat a critical success or a regular success as a critical success. Heightened Senses, your instinct heightens each of your senses further. You become a master in proficiency instead of just being an expert at it. Quick Rage at 17th level. You recover from rage quickly and are soon ready to begin anew. So after you spend a full turn without raging, you can rage again without needing to wait 1 minute. So that's sort of a callback to how it initially was with the playtest, but it's a much higher level thing, and your rage lasts longer to begin with. But if you get knocked unconscious, for example, and you get back up at 17th level, you can actually be able to rage again the following round, which is, I think, a pretty decent ability there. Armor of Fury, your training and rage deepen your connection to your armor. Your proficiency ranks in light, medium armor, and no armor increase to master. And then at 19th level, you get Devastator. Your strikes are so devastating that you hardly care about resistance, and your barbarian abilities are unparalleled. Your proficiency rank in the barbarian class DC increases to master, and your melee strikes ignore 10 points of a creature's resistance to their physical damage. So that is a difference between the playtest and here. The playtest, it was double your con modifier. In this case, it is just a set number. And now we're going to take a look at instincts. Like I said, these are very similar to the totems, though there are some slight differences here. So instincts. You channel your rage through an instinct. You decide what your instinct means to you. It could be a creature or symbol beloved by your clan, or purely an eternal source or filter for your rage, such as belief, curse, heritage, state of mind. Each instinct grants an instinct ability, plus more abilities you gain via instinct feats, which you can choose when you gain barbarian feats as you progress through your class progression. It also determines what damage you resist with Raging Resistance, and at higher levels increases the additional damage you deal with your rage. So these dictate how you increase that extra damage from rage, and not just the your level every so often. Each instinct lists acts that are anathema to it. Whenever you perform such acts, you lose the instinct's ability and any instinct feats until you spend 1 day of downtime recentering yourself, though you keep all other barbarian abilities. So that's, again, similar to what we had before. You still get your regular rage, but you don't gain the specialization, the resistance, or abilities that you would get normally from your instinct if you do something that's anathema to it. So we're going to take a look at the animal instinct here. So animal instinct, the fury of a wild predator fills when you rage, granting you vicious unarmed attacks. Creatures that revere vicious animals, such as apes or bears, give rise to barbarians with this instinct. You might also be at war with an uncontrollable animalistic side of your personality, or you might be a descendant of a werewolf or another were creature. Select an animal from the table here, 3-3, animal instincts that best matches your chosen animal. The options we have here are ape, bear, bull, cat, deer, frog, shark, snake, and wolf. Again, we're not going to go through every single one here, but they all list an unarmed attack, as well as damage for that attack, and traits that the attack might have. Anathema is flagrantly disrespecting an animal of your chosen kind, as is using weapons while raging. So if you're not raging, you can still use weapons while attacking, but if you fly into a rage, the idea is that you don't use physical weapons. Because your rage or your instinct ability is called Bestial Rage, when you rage, you gain your chosen animal's unarmed attack or attacks. The specific attack gained, the damage it deals, and its traits are listed on the chart we had up above here. Animal instincts, that's the name of the chart. These attacks are in the Brawling group, and your rage action gains the Morph, Primal, and Transmutation traits. So we're just going to take a look at 2 of them here. We're going to take a look at we'll take a look at Bear, I guess, for starters. So Bear gives you a Jaw attack or a Claw attack. The Jaw does 1d10 piercing damage, and it's considered unarmed. The Bear's Claw does 1d6 and is considered to be agile and unarmed. And just keep in mind that if something has the agile trait, your bonus damage from your rage is actually halved. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And then we have, let's just take a look at the shark, which gives you a jaw attack that does 1d10. It has the grapple and unarmed abilities to it. The specialization ability, which is what you gain at 7th level. So this one says increase the damage die one size for unarmed strikes granted by your chosen animal by 1 step. Increase the additional damage from rage from 2 to 5 for your chosen animal's unarmed attacks. The frog's tongue attack, which just does a d4, and the deer's antler attack, which does a d8, now gain a 10-foot reach instead of just the regular melee range that you would typically have. If you have greater weapon specialization, you increase the damage from rage from 5 to 12. And then increasing the damage die, so a d10 goes up to a d12, d6 to a d8, d8 to a d10, and a d4 to a d6. And then the raging resistance is you resist piercing and slashing damage. So that's the animal one. Again, I'm not going to go through all these. The next one I want to look at here is going to be the Fury Instinct, because we did look at that one directly with the playtest. And this one says, your rage comes from a deep and purely personal will within you. You use your rage as you choose. Anathema and instinct ability. You don't have anathema or an instinct ability. Instead, you gain additional first level barbarian feat. So that means that essentially you're never going to lose access to it. So, for example, if something happened and you had to use a weapon, like a manufactured weapon, and you were, using the animal instinct rage, then, you would lose those abilities. So with the Fury one, again, you don't risk that, but you also don't gain as much unique abilities in exchange for having them constantly, being reliable and being able to use. Specialization abilities, you increase the damage from rage from 2 to 6, so slightly higher because we had 4, or we went from 2 to 5 with most of the other ones. So you get slightly more, and if you have greater weapon specialization, you instead go from, you increase it to 12, which I think with the other one is the same number there, but at least the lower level gives you slightly more damage. And then the raging resistance is you resist physical weapon damage, but not physical damage from other sources, such as unarmed attacks. So you resist like actual weapons like swords, bows, maces, axes, stuff like that, but fists or animal attacks like claws, bites, things like that, you don't gain the resistance to. And then, like I said, we have our barbarian feats. Again, they're very similar to what we had in the playtest. Some of them, have the rage feature, which means you can use them while raging, even if they normally require concentrate. And they're just very similar to a lot of the rage abilities that we had in Pathfinder First Edition. Things like Moment of Clarity, Acute Vision, like I said before. You also have the Sudden Charge, which allows you to move twice your speed and attack, which would normally be 3 actions in of itself. But you can actually do it as just 2 actions here. And again, there's just a lot of great abilities that like I said, I'm not going to go into fully, but we did, discuss at least a couple of them. And yeah, some of them even mimic just regular feats like Cleave and Great Cleave. So Cleave, the trigger is your melee attack kills a creature or knocks it unconscious, and another foe is adjacent. You just swing through one foe into another, and then you get to make a strike against them. And then Great Cleave. Your Fury carries your weapon through multiple foes. When you cleave, if your strike also kills or knocks the target unconscious, you can continue to make melee strikes until you make a strike that doesn't kill or knock creature unconscious. So some of them again replicate feats that in the Dungeons and Dragons versions of the Barbarian from 3rd edition, for example, that you would normally be taking. They're just sort of included here as part of the Barbarian specific class feats, as well as things that function like the Barbarian Rage abilities that we had in First Edition Pathfinder, and there are some that are specific to the instinct that you choose. For example, you have the Dragon's Rage Wings, which require you to have the Dragon Instinct. So yeah, so that's again some of the abilities that we have there for the 2nd Edition Pathfinder Barbarian. Now, at this point, I did say at the beginning of this video that I was going to wrap all the Pathfinder stuff up in one single video. Unfortunately, I recorded that a day before when my Advanced Player's Guide, I was almost positive I was going to have it the day that I decided to be recording this. Plus, this is kind of a longer video, and I feel like I should give the Pathfinder videos in this series sort of the same amount of episodes or of installments as I do with the D&D one, because I do think that both of these games are absolutely fantastic. So, because I'm lacking one of the books that I thought I was going to have, and because I sort of reconsidered those plans, I'm going to wrap it up for this video here today. However, in just a few days' time, I will have the actual, honest to God this time, finale to the Barbarian Through the Ages series when I look at the Pathfinder alternate versions of Barbarian class features. So, anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you've enjoyed this series so far, and I'm looking forward to moving on from the Barbarian and going into the Noble Bard. We just have to make one more stop along the way. So thanks again very much for watching. I appreciate your support, and I will see you next time. Take care.